Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written. This show gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us, and we're going to dive deep into the bizarre origins, the surprising mechanics, and the tiny fine print of games you know or likely have never heard of. I'm your host today, Troy, and joining me is my co-host, Max. Working behind the scenes with us, as always, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about Chill, 2nd edition. We're going to take a look at the second offering of this classic horror role-playing game.
So a note before we get too far into this. We did try to find any kind of copy, physical or PDF, of the first edition, and we just came up empty on this. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem because this is a game in its own right, but it would help make more sense of some of the changes in this particular edition. Just as a little bit of history to this. So the original game was created by Pacesetter Ltd. In 1984. And then the second edition was created by Mayfair Games in 1990. And Mayfair Games is probably more known for its board games like Carcassonne and, I can't remember what other ones, but that'd probably be the obvious one. And it's kind of odd that I've never really thought of them as making something that would be like a role-playing game, but they did make this. Just for reference on the origin of this game, Call of Cthulhu came out in 1981, and there's a lot of interesting similarities between that game and this game, partly because of its dice resolution system, it being a D100-based game, as well as some other aspects. But the actual themes of the games attempt to draw distinctions between them, and we can get more into that later. So the printing is a 2-column textbook format, which would be very popular at this particular time. This is around the era where we're really moving away from box set games, and we're moving more into the rule book as we kind of understand it today. Obviously, all the way back in 1977, Gary put out the AD&D book set. That took a little while to catch on, and some companies were jumping into that sooner than others. But this is the first edition of Chill, which is a book, just a book. The design of this book is, I don't know how to say, it's very of its era. It's funny that this predates Vampire the Masquerade by 1 year, but the layout design inside, for better or worse, is very similar. I think White Wolf's Vampire did it better, even though there's some kind of artistic strangeness going on in that one. But in this particular book, we spotted some very questionable page layouts.
Yeah.
The best example of this, though not the only example, is on page 10, where it's describing the core attributes or characteristics for a character. And there is this splatter effect, this ink splatter effect, which in and of itself seems cool, but it's a color of purple that is almost dark enough to be the same color as the text. And because of the irregularity of the splotches, the spray from the ink, it makes the text almost unreadable.
Yeah, I see what they were going for, but it definitely is a miss when you actually have to learn what the attributes are.
Yeah, there's a few other pages where there's like foot or handprints that have that same purple, but the solidity of that imprint is large enough that your eye can kind of adjust, whereas with this spray, there's so much noise between white and purple, that it was actually a chore to try and read it. Thankfully, that was the worst example.
Yeah.
The rest of the book read fine. That failing aside, one of my favorite things about this is the cover, which is a drawn collage on a black background. And it's funny to say that, so I don't know how many people might know this, but the Vampire Masquerade cover was a big deal when it came out because it wasn't a piece of drawn art. It was literally a rose on a marble table, and it was a photograph, and then it had the words imposed on it. And if you look at anything after that, that minimalistic photograph style of art, like if you look at a lot of the covers for a 3rd edition D&D, they are sculpted photographs that look like the cover of a book. And it's partly kind of drawing influence from that. In this case, it's still drawn art, but it's minimalistic. It's mostly black, and then it has this sort of collaged face, this kind of evil-looking face on it. And the words chill have that kind of serial killer cutout look. But weirdly enough, all of these elements are actually illustrated.
Yeah, it's got the ransom note vibe. However, it's just all drawn.
Yeah, like, and the collage effects on the face are all drawn as well. And then, yeah, it's just this black book. So I think, at least from an artistic point of view, as well as some of the illustrations inside, I think half of them work really well. Half of them are a little bit generic or overly detailed, or they don't fit what the page might be demonstrating as far as rules. But I think overall, the art of this book is pretty nice, and that cover is particularly good.
So to move on to talking about the system of the game itself, we'll start with character creation, as that's the origin point for most of role-playing games and where these books start. In Chill, there are multiple methods to create a character. Some of these are going to be pretty familiar to us nowadays, but you'll have a pre-made character that you can start with, or just take whole hog, customizable templates that you can start with and start to make meaningful decisions on. And then lastly, you can start completely from scratch and just be rolling up your attributes, from zeros. So between the three of those, you can really get a different experience. I mean, starting from scratch, I would argue, is probably the most rewarding for most people, as they get to actualize a character they're most personally interested in. But if you want to get a game quick, or if you're organizing a one-shot or convention game, the templates can be really helpful for just, here you go.
I kind of think of the template as, in this particular game, as sort of splitting the difference between a class or profession and not entirely a pre-generated character, but more of a kind of stopgap between that and building it entirely customized. I would say you're right. Building it from scratch means that you can have the concept of what you want to play in your head before you get going. We haven't really explained what the game's focus. Maybe we could probably touch on that.
Yeah, let's hit that.
Okay, so Chill is a horror role-playing game that focuses itself more on, I don't want to simplify it in saying it's everything that isn't Lovecraft, but that is sort of sometimes how I've heard it described. But it's things like literary gothic horror, folk horror to some degree. I think Hammer horror films play a big part in what that genre actually is. So, you've got you're going to have those classic movie monster tropes in this. This edition doesn't really lean into that idea any more than it tries to be a broad horror system. And from any reviews that I've read about the earlier edition, it did the flavor of that theme much better than this edition, even though this edition apparently has better rules. Again, I would love to actually read the first edition, and if anyone out there has a copy of that, please get in touch with us, and then we can review it.
That would be very cool.
But yeah, it's kind of is everything that Call of Cthulhu is not. Now, it's arguable as to how much that actually makes it stand out, because I can certainly see playing that kind of horror scenario using the Call of Cthulhu game, whatever edition. And there's certain, we'll call them similarities and differences in this system that I don't know would be better or worse than using Call of Cthulhu. I don't want to overly compare the two, but it's kind of hard to avoid.
There's also a lot of Lovecraftian examples of what is effectively a vampire, just with a twist.
Yep.
With the cosmic horror bent on it. So I mean, you for sure could do a lot of that in Call of Cthulhu, but some of what this game wants you to do is to tell ghost stories and tell vampire stories and werewolf stories. And those can be different.
Yeah.
Mechanically, are these the best rules for it? Like you're kind of saying, I don't know. That I'm not sold on after reading this game.
Yeah.
I will be honest.
It is neither distinct or campy enough to really get me a sense of distinction. Another point to make is that a third edition of this game more or less just came out. And I'm also interested to see how they tackle the theming issue, because I do think that is possibly the strength or weakness of this game, depending on how much you lean into that. Because I do think that Call of Cthulhu, especially in, say, 7th edition, very much rests on the Cthulhu mythos, at least at this point. You can certainly find stats for classic monsters and they might even have that. I know from 6th edition, which is the one I'm a bit more familiar, they had like a vampire and a werewolf and a zombie in the book. I don't know. Again, I'm going to be running my first 7th edition campaign soon, so I'm still going through the book, but I don't remember there being anything to that degree or anything like that. But the kinds of characters that you're playing in this game are like Van Helsing characters or any of the characters from, as I said, like the hero characters from a Hammer horror film. It's funny because they talk about tone in this edition of Chill toward the back, and they're having like a bunch of different types where there's even like comedic horror, like, what's that Roman Polanski film, like The Intrepid Vampire Killers or something like that.
Oh, okay. Yep.
And that at least tonally fits it because it's these sort of Van Helsing style monster hunters that go after a vampire and then hijinks ensue. Again, it's one of those things where this edition of the game, I should say, the choice to be more generic doesn't really work in its favor. Not necessarily because it occupies the same space as, say, Call of Cthulhu, but just because it's not leaning into its strengths. So those are the heroes you're playing. Now, those heroes are primarily based on the core attributes that each character has. So some games might be more skill-based, and this is a skill-based game, or at least it calculates the same way, but the core attributes play a big role in how skills actually work.
That's right.
Yeah, so those attributes are agility, dexterity, luck, perception, personality, stamina, strength, willpower. Worth noting that stamina and strength are also derivative values, which are effectively like health and mind points.
Yeah, those are your resources effectively, right?
Those are like when you take damage, you take it as stamina damage and also as wounds. And there's a curious parallel to another game or to Vampire when we get to wounds that weirdly enough, this predates. So I'm wondering exactly where it's coming from. It might be in Ars Magica. I don't remember how the health system in that game works. The other thing, which is very much I think of as a late 80s, early 90s role-playing game mechanic, or I don't want to call it a mechanic, but kind of an approach, is, I guess you could call it an advantage and disadvantage system. Probably is earliest and best example is GURPS, which is really founded on that idea. Like characters are built out of this complex network of character points that can either be spent on advantages or you can get more points if you buy disadvantages to create a more textured character. This game has a similar element, which they call edges and drawbacks. And it's also something that shows up in Vampire a little later. So I feel that it's weird to see this sort of parallel trend where this game occupies a space between Call of Cthulhu and Vampire, which are both horror games, and kind of has elements of both.
Yeah, it does.
But I don't know that it was an influence on those games in any way, or that those games influenced it. I get the suspicion that Chill is probably influenced partly by Call of Cthulhu, but it's really hard to say exactly how.
Well, in the skills and the way that you do the D100, it's kind of like a Call of Cthulhu, right?
A little bit, though they do this in a funky way that I don't know. It's not bad necessarily, but it's strange. So let's explain how skill checks work. And this is kind of the fundamental resolution mechanic that you'll be rolling up most of the time.
Yeah.
So it's a D100 roll, and it's rolled under whatever attribute is valid. Skills in this game they start off equal to whatever attribute they're connected to, or some of them are the average of 2 of those attributes, or 3 in some cases. So in order to calculate one of those skills, you would take, for instance, I'm not sure that I have an example in front of me right now, but you would take something like agility and perception, you'd add them together and divide by 2. If it was 3 of them, say it was agility, luck, and perception, then you would take the value of those and divide it by 3, and you'd get the average. That's how a skill starts, and the skill level for this is called student, but we'll get into that later. So when you make the roll, if the rolls, so you roll a D100, if you only make the target number within 10 points, so basically if the target number was 56 and then you rolled a 54 it's considered a low success. And that only makes up about 10% of the end. And that is a success, but it can have not the best circumstances. Like there's usually some kind of drawback for succeeding. Like you pick the lock, but maybe you break it and you can't unpick it, or you can't use it with conventional tools. The lock, or you lose the lock picks because they get jammed in there or bent.
Yeah.
That would be one example. Or, you're sneaking around, you manage to clear that corner, but then as you do, like a vase falls and makes a lot of noise, which doesn't draw attention to you specifically, but does draw attention to the general area. Then above that, your skill is divided in half from that point. The lower half of that skill, closer to the target number, is your moderate success, which is sort of what we would consider to be a normal success. And then there's a high success on the other half of the skill. So again, if we were to say take 50 and you rolled between 50 and 25, that would be moderate. If you rolled above 25, that would be high. Then the last 10% on that, so if you roll within the upper percentile, which in this case would be any digit starting with a 0, you get a colossal success, which is this game's name for a critical.
And these different outcomes will give you a little bit of nuance to your checks. They give you the way the GM will interpret the outcome of your intended actions. But it is something that's a little finicky to get on the fly until you're a little bit used to it. It's not too bad, but it's just not as elegant as something that does it in increments of 10, for example, right? Like 10 degrees of success.
Yeah. So both Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition and Call of Cthulhu, well, most editions of Call of Cthulhu, but we can use 7th, for example, have these simpler, more elegant ways of doing this to get the range of success. So Wolf Rap 4 does it by measuring every degree of 10 over the target number, and that's one extra degree of success. So in this case, it's a more numerically gritty. But the nice thing about that is that it returns a value rather than, say, a level of success. But if you want to talk level of success, we can talk Call of Cthulhu, where there is a major and critical success, which is just, I can't remember, it's within 1/5, I think, is one value. And then I'm trying to remember what the other one was. Rather than, it's more like an exponential cutting down of the skill number.
That's right.
And the nice thing about doing it that way is that you can look, Call of Cthulhu 7th does a really, really good job of providing you a table where you can literally just look up what major and critical success you actually fall within on a skill. And because it's done in that sort of linear exponential growth, so it's not going small, big, big, small, like Jill is doing. It's really easy to make a graph that works that way.
Yeah, agreed.
Like any of these games, modifiers are applied to the target number, which is based, again, on your skill. And the level can be moved back and forth. One way that you can use to improve a skill beyond having the attribute work in your favor, because as I said, it's just the average or whole number of that attribute, is to have skill levels. Now, this game has 3 skill levels, full stop. And this is another one of these decisions where I'm like, was that the simplest, most elegant way to do this? So the levels are student, teacher, master. That's catchy because we're familiar with that concept. But student merely means you have the skill listed and do not receive a penalty for using it if it's something that anyone could do.
Yes.
Which is weird because I would have just had the attribute, if it were me, I'd just have the attribute be the untrained and then add values above that. But in this case, that student is just no penalty. Then teacher is +10, master is +15. That's basically it.
And that's just a modifier to the base score.
It is, and to that skill specifically. So if I had lockpicking teacher, then it would be those attributes that make up that skill +10.
Right.
And to be fair, when I say plus, I believe what they mean by master being +15 is on top of the teacher skill. So technically it's +25.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a significant bump.
In a percentile game, that's pretty meaty. Most of the other mechanics regarding skills and skill rolls are nothing that you haven't seen in most percentile D100 based role-playing games. So like an opposed check is basically just a contest between the two and whoever gets the higher level of success. Again, I think Wolf Rep 4 does this better because you're actually generating a number from both values. So if someone gets 3 successes and someone gets 4 successes, there's a bit more tension there rather than trying to pass these thresholds between low and moderate or moderate and high. I feel like you could get a draw in this game a lot more often with an opposed roll. Whereas if you gradiate it the way that Warhammer Fantasy does it, it's unlikely that you're going to get a stalemate in your opposed roll.
And there are also specialty skills that apply, where some skills will have like a subset or a skill within a skill, and that'll give you an additional bonus. The example we talked about earlier was handguns and firearms, right?
Sure. I'm not sure that we mentioned that, but that is a good example. So yeah, you might have a firearm skill, and then within that you have a handgun skill, and there's a synergy that translates to the more general. So having the handgun skill only gives you proficiency with handguns, but some portion of that could be translated to firearms more generally. One cool inversion that this system does is what's called a called shot. And this is almost like this sort of specialty skill taken the other way in your favor. The obvious example of a called shot in other games, and it does apply in Chill in this way, is that instead of trying to shoot blindly at a target, you choose a particular body part, like I'm going to try to shoot the gun out of his hand. And so obviously that becomes more difficult, but it gets you a more specifically desired result. The neat thing about the mechanic as it's described in Chill, at least in this edition, is that you can do that with any skill. So you can try to achieve a more specific result, and it's kind of like the special skills, but done intentionally. So I'm trying to think of a way to do that. Like, I'm trying to get someone to like me, so you use some kind of persuasion skill. But maybe you're trying to get someone to really like this book I'm reading, because that'll make better leverage. So it narrows the target, making that a bit more difficult. I don't know how good this concept actually is in practice, but it sounds neat.
Yeah, I like the appeal of being able to flex other skills outside of combat and use them in more targeted ways. How often that would come up and not just be a player trying to get, trying to like weasel a little plus 10 or so. I don't know, but it is something that is kind of neat to have.
That was a standout. Again, my main criticism of this game is that it just doesn't stand out that much. And as I said, from reading of reviews of it that came out when the game came out, is that a lot of people lamented the lack of theming that had been in the previous edition. Then you've got your untrained skills, which I mentioned. It's basically whatever the skill would normally be, and then you have a penalty taken to that. I believe that penalty is -10, but based on other modifiers, it could be more than that, depending on, say, how knowledgeable you need to be in that skill in order to do it, or how knowledgeable your character might specifically be in order to do it.
And some skills, like the advanced ones, you require training before you can even do them. So they're not considered innate at all.
Exactly. And it only would apply to an innate skill. So you would have to be able to do it without any prior knowledge of the task. Full stop. Modifiers, of course, tools and equipment. There's the amount of time given to you can be a modifier, which is something I don't know that often gets mentioned in games, but is definitely a useful thing. And of course, working against you are environmental conditions, improvised tools, obviously having less time or having other things happening. It's very hard to change a tire in a gunfight. Yeah, then there's experience points, which is referred to EP in this case instead of XP, and I don't know if that's just a contrarianism.
Yep.
I often suspect that some of these things, while being improvements on the rules of the previous edition, are contrarianisms, where I'm like, oh, are you just doing that because that's what's not being done, and that would make the author feels that this game would be more distinct by having that? Because sometimes I think convention is a good thing. There's a reason why most controller layouts and controller designs in video games more or less have gravitated toward the same design. And I think that's true of role-playing games to some extent. One of the other ways to develop things is through training.
Oh, yes, I like this. It does give you something to do during downtime. So It's pretty limited. It doesn't give you like a lot to grip onto with this, but it does explain that you can improve your skills if you have the three ingredients of resources, a teacher, and time available. So if you wanted to increase one of your skills or your specialty skills or work on that, you're fully able to do so, but you would need to be able to have access to someone who could impart that wisdom to you.
I think it's sort of obvious from the type of game. Horror games usually fall into this category, but this is an investigative problem-solving game. But of course, it is a pre-Gumshoe, if people are familiar with that reference. I have certain opinions about the Gumshoe system, but generally I think the thought process behind it is very positive. There's no way to structure that mystery in the sense that the clue would be obvious, but then finding extra things. So if you don't have the right skills, you might be struggling for a while. They do suggest the idea of giving hints or thinking outside of the box or letting players converse to figure things out. But it's sort of that, it seems a little brute forcey if you don't really know how to run that type of a game.
Yeah.
And I definitely recommend people read Gumshoe. Even if you don't use that system, the philosophy behind it for running a mystery game is pretty well must read. So now we move on to how wounds and damage and health kind of work in the game, which is it's kind of unique, but not really. Troy, maybe you can explain it, and then I'll kind of explain what I think the parallels might be here.
So you will attack with a D100 roll, and your degree of success will determine the strike ranks, which is a way to, it's not RuneQuest, but it's a way to describe the division of damage, which factors into stamina loss and wound loss, or wound accumulation, I should clarify. How this works in practice is you can make your roll kind of like when it's a skill check. You check to see your range of success, where you fall on your strike rank, which is different with different weapons. And then you will consult the damage. So there's a bit of augury happening here. There's some consulting required. So it's not a straight damage roll that you're relying on or anything as straightforward or direct as that.
Mm-hmm.
But it will give you some variety to the different weapon outcomes. And then once you have done all stamina damage, you are into wounds, and wounds are classified as 4 different levels. Kind of, again, not that different than the 4 degrees of success, but there are light, moderate, serious, and critical. And those are the wounds that you'll take or dish out. And each wound has a level, of corresponding wound points. And wound point reduction will impact the character's abilities. So as you take damage, you are going to suffer impairment. And once you reach 0 wound points, you'll hit incapacitation and you'll be out of the fight.
Going into negative values will then result in death. And we're coming to something familiar there.
Death saves. We all love them.
There's some interesting parallels to this because there's obviously a hit point system.
Yeah.
And stamina can be used to do other things if there's a moment of strain, like, oh, you're trying to climb up something. I think there's a deduction that can be applied for stamina there.
Yep.
Like if you had to climb a wall and it took a long time, then...
Or burst down a door or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's not applied to combat except in the terms of absorbing damage. Or I guess maybe if you strain yourself through something you do. But stamina can be recovered quite quickly, but it is very much depending on your physical condition. So you can rest, and I believe they said for every round of combat where no action is taken, you get stamina back, which might be a bit fiddly, but not necessarily a problem. But then that return is modified by the wound level that you're at.
Yes.
Also, determining the strike rank in combat kind of requires, I mean, I think you could kind of memorize some of these things, but it does require you to look up on a chart what that actually reflects as in terms of damage.
Yeah, exactly.
The strike rank goes down, and then you have to roll for the stamina loss, and then look across to the next column to see where the wound gain, I suppose, is. Because I guess the idea is you're gaining wounds and losing stamina. I like what this is trying to simulate, but I don't know that this is the easiest way to do this. And there's always that issue about finding the balance between having a system that reflects what combat actually feels like And especially in a horror game, I think you really get the opportunity to have something that isn't meant to feel heroic. So you can be, there's almost an invitation to be more simulationist about it.
Yeah.
Call of Cthulhu certainly does this, and it's taking its influence from RuneQuest, which is a very different kind of fantasy game. But it can employ hit locations as a way of kind of handling that, where hit points are spread across the body, more or less. And the loss or depletion of hit points in a particular limb debilitates that. In this case, I see the light, moderate, serious critical wounds being, and again, this game wouldn't have come out just yet, but Vampire uses a very similar system where it has these ranks that move through these levels. At least the first edition did. When you get to Chronicles of Darkness, it's more like straight up hit points. In the original game, there are these sort of tiers of injury, and then points are fixed, and they're actually the same for every character. There's a kind of standardization to that method that I think Vampire probably does better than in this case, where it's actually tracking points and levels at the same time. As I said, I don't always agree with the methods, though some of the ideas are really neat in this game. Serious and critical wounds are interesting in that they require professional medical assistance. So this is like if you broke your leg or you were like bleeding out or had some kind of internal injury. I think breaking your leg could arguably be fixed by someone non-professional, splinting it. But yeah, for like ruptured organs and stuff like that, you definitely need to see a doctor.
Yes.
And that's advice to all of you.
And that's from us, official. And you can also do first aid stabilization to restore small amounts of wound points for lighter and more moderate wounds. So that's something you can do for the lower tiers of damage. But you'll also tend to rely on natural healing with rest and recovery, depending on the severity rate of your damage. So that's a big part of it too. When you're doing your natural healing, you cannot double dip and also do your downtime training. So it's like kind of one or the other. So if you have a wounded party member, other people can do downtime training in their abilities and skills, for example.
And there are permanent injuries that can accumulate depending on how often you dip into that more serious condition. So the combat mechanics of the game, again, nothing too surprising here. You've got action rounds where each character takes a turn. Initiative is determined by rolling 1d10 and then adding agility or other relevant attributes to it. And then the highest one goes first. Attack rolls are basically just a d100 skill roll. The degree of success will determine, based on the weapon being used, what strike ranks are actually dealt. And if someone is defending against you, it becomes an opposed roll. And pretty simple as, if you're parrying or blocking or dodging, then it has the necessary outcome of using those. And if you win the contest, then you don't get dealt damage. As I said, damage calculation is a little cumbersome, but I can see maybe if you played it enough, you get used to what the values would be.
Yeah, I agree. You would have to get familiar with it for it to really click. But it does have another Call of Cthulhu ism or D100 game ism, because we see this in other D100 games a lot, where your character can choose a dodge or parry action in response to an attack as a defensive choice.
It's quite true, yeah.
And you got to make a skill check, and this can, either reduce or negate the damage, right? But it's just interesting that you don't see that in your classic D20 fare very often. That's just built into AC or something.
Yeah.
But here it's like a very specific thing that you declare, much like it is in Warhammer Fantasy, much like it is in Call of Cthulhu. But it is, again, if you want to include Warhammer Fantasy as a horror game, it kind of is like horror fantasy, right?
Yeah.
They all sort of have that choice there. And I think it's interesting that they all share that. There's just this common thread that keeps coming up between these D100 games that you can kind of see whether they mean to or not, they do borrow from each other.
Yeah, there's a lineage of thought that cuts kind of through all of them. And I understand the reason why ACEX exists, mainly for expedience.
Yeah, it just makes it easier.
Yeah, it also, typically games like Chill or other percentile games also have damage reducing armor. Or in this case, armor reduces strike ranks, which effectively reduces stamina and other damage. The idea of having that be very simple in Dungeons & Dragons is I believe that had to do with the fact that it was easier for tournament play because you didn't have to work out any kind of extra math. You either hit or you don't, and by how much.
Right.
Simple as. There is damage reduction, obviously, in Dungeons & Dragons, but it's more of a special quality. As I mentioned, armor reduces the incoming damage. It's not as sophisticated as armor in other games, but then if you think of this being either a contemporary setting or at least a modern setting, so, 19th century, I mean, you even maybe a bit earlier than that, armor is a lot less of a thing, though, again, it is mentioned, and there's a lot of different ways you can handle it. Also, yeah, the time period of this game is also very generic. It kind of bills itself as a modern game, and the art would suggest as much, but yeah, the technology in the game is a bit all over the place.
Right. It's very 20th century ?
Yeah, I would call it a modern game, but I mean that in the broadest possible sense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Which is modern starting somewhere in the 19th century as a sort of nascent concept, and then in the 20th century becoming a more sort of codified concept that goes into it. A more solid word that means something specifically as opposed to, we're modernizing.
Yeah.
It's very industrial era.
Yeah. Well, it's the primary weapons of import are firearms, right?
Yeah.
Those are the guns that you need to have. They're going to be the equalizer, and it's not a game of strong sword arms. That's not how you're going to vanquish a foe. You're going to blast them. To
be fair, if you're fighting a vampire, I don't know a gun is going to help you that much either. So the next area that we kind of get into is, I guess, I don't even know if I can call this unique necessarily, but it's what is referred to as the art. And that's just magic. There is some flavoring to the art, which I don't know exactly how to parse it. So it's divided into 3 categories, which are protective, offensive, and communicative disciplines. And they sort of resemble something like psychic powers, I think is the best way I could describe it, though they sometimes push beyond that.
In addition to the psychic mind power nature of the art, there's also sort of a divine clerical aspect to it as well. And you use willpower points to use the art. And this is how you will perform your magic. You'll also use it against fear checks and to resist the attacks of the evil way. Basically bad guy magic. And the evil way, though, I don't know. But anyways, the art is divided into 3 main categories that we've already talked about. But for you to be able to use any of the abilities in those categories, you're going to have a certain minimum ability score. So that could be luck or personality. And the art also is a lot like a specialty skill.
Yeah.
Or an advanced skill, because it's going to require you to actually have minimal training in it. So you're going to have to start as a student before you can even attempt the ability.
Yeah, and even that would be, I wouldn't call it risky, but nothing may come of it. And it may be just something you attempt to and may want to rely on your luck mechanics, which come next. And again, these are nothing that we haven't seen. Obviously, luck mechanics come out of the point system for altering the outcome of rolls, which originates most likely from the 007 role-playing game from much earlier. And I think is a neat addition. I think it definitely says something about your game if you have these. I don't think it's necessary. But yeah, you can use it to either reduce the value of the roll that you've made. So basically, you can spend a point of luck to reduce the outcome by that value to bring it closer to your target, or rather farther above the target, I should say. Or you can use it in the same measurement to avoid damage. So you can use it to absorb a hit, which I kind of like using luck in that way because it's like the shot almost hits you or it grazes you instead of digs right into you.
Yeah.
Using luck as a kind of health is, I think, a neat idea because then it really makes a distinction between what is meat and fortune. If people are familiar with that dichotomy of hit points. Regaining luck is usually as a reward, but it can be kind of restored between sessions.
It's a GM thing, though, right?
It is, yeah, and completing a significant event, but it's really up to the GM when that's given back. You can use luck to kind of avoid some effects of injuries, like critical effects, but yeah, this is... it's sort of the meeting point in telling the story between the GM and the player And if the GM thinks that you're overusing the luck or going too far, they might require you to do more luck checks, and that may have some bad results because you've used up the luck.
I like the idea of you attracting supernatural attention, like sort of a reverse luck by using it too much. I think that's a fun play on that.
And of course, the game wouldn't be a horror game if it didn't have some kind of fear mechanics, which compared to something like Call of Cthulhu aren't quite as detailed as Sanity, but they're definitely there. So yeah, there's fear checks, which are resisted by using willpower, and willpower can even be reduced partly by fear. Effects of fear can be everything from panicking and seizing up to having sort of panic attacks. It's almost a bit more like fear, or the way that panic is treated in the new Alien game, the Free League one. But it doesn't have even as much detail as that does. See next episode for fear mechanics. I don't know. It didn't even seem that different from some fear mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons in a lot of ways, which, to be fair, are more prevalent in this and are used more often. But a lot of it was, it forces you to run away, or it forces you to freeze, or over prolonged time, it could cause some serious trauma.
But they are like temporary status effects more than anything else.
Yeah, there can be an accumulative value, so that they market that if you got really scared that one time, you stop functioning in a socially acceptable way.
But terror checks, those are the ones where you can take the significant damage.
Yes, so that's usually reserved for things that are really messed up. But in this case, I don't know what, like, if you saw a vampire and you knew it was a vampire, how actually terrifying would that be? I mean, aside from the threat because it's just a guy with pale skin and long teeth. And again, I'm going with the Hammer horror model. So he probably looks like a normal guy most of the time.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like, for example, in some settings, when you're contending with like an astral monster, from some other plane of existence, like a terror check makes a lot of sense. In this, having the two different tiers, it's almost like seeing a scary man is fearful, but seeing a scary monster is terror. Like again, it's one of those things where there are distinctions, but what is the meaning between those distinctions that I don't fully understand.
Yeah.
But I mean, what's kind of interesting is, you can recover from fear through receiving support from other characters, from rest and downtime, or from even having successful fear checks that you perform will help you deal with fear that you have suffered in the past, if you know what I'm trying to say. Oh, and the art too. There are the healing discipline, for example, can help you alleviate fear-induced trauma or recover points or do a lot of restorative things.
Yeah, for sure. So the last part of the book is actually maybe some of the best material. So it contains things like rules for creating your own creatures or campaign construction and guidelines for doing that. But it also has some good advice that I don't know is any different from the advice given to other role-playing games, but sometimes just the rewording of it or the attention to certain details of play can be actually really useful. So, but I don't know that it's worth getting I don't know that I go out of the way to buy the book unless you're interested in reading it for the sake of reading it. Because as I said, there's a new edition of this. So now we can get into the lore of the game, which is...
It's interesting.
It's actually a lot like the good and bad things of this game, where it is both very specific and not that specific.
So there's an international secretive organization, SAVE, as the moniker is, right?
Yeah, SAVE. So that's a bit of a goofy acronym, but at least it breaks down into something that I think might be genuine Latin, but I'm not really sure. So it's Societas Albia Fiae Eternitata. Yeah, I probably said that wrong. I haven't actually looked up a translation because we came down in the recording time before I was able to do that. But at least it's being a bit evocative, as opposed to just being like, super action vampire elimination or something like that. But yeah, so it's a secret society, and it pits itself against the unknown, which is not actually an organization. It's just what SAVE calls all of the monsters and bad things that exist in the world and the people that help them.
That's right.
Its members are called envoys, I guess that's kind of interesting. They investigate different happenings that are going on around the world. Oh, okay. Jay just looked up the translation. It's Eternal Society of the White Way. Okay, so I assume this is like white magic being like divine or holy magic. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
That kind of fits with its tone because it's founded in the 19th century by scholars and occultists, and it's effectively looking to understand and combat the rise of supernatural activity. So I guess it's indicating that there's been some type of increase or uptick in supernatural events, you might say. And the organization, in addition to its external conflicts, has many internal challenges and has almost been destroyed more than once by powerful entities.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to think of like a movie equivalent to this. So the old man from Monster Squad, if anyone gets that reference. That's kind of how the vibe that I feel, where it's like, oh yes, we're a secret order of people that protect the world from monsters. They fight against the unknown, which are basically all supernatural phenomena, including ghosts, vampires, werewolves, other more obscure things, which I guess they have some description of. Some things I don't know that are supernatural creatures, like that fit into this. Like, would they fight the Yeti or the lake monster? I mean, maybe if it was being super evil.
Right. Would they go after Loch Ness or Ogopogo? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a very good question. But they also are artifact hunters too.
That's true. Yeah. They go around the world and try to secure special artifacts. And you could see a campaign or at least an adventure, which is about almost, I guess, having an Indiana Jones vibe. And I haven't really thought of that in terms of a type of flavor of campaign or adventure where, I mean, you could do that in Dungeons and Dragons, of course. You can have a divine focused campaign, or the cleric character is leading the heroes to find some famous artifact. But yeah.
There is also what is referred to as the Concordat. And that is a series of principles, guidelines, and effectively like governing operational principles that SAVE uses to like emphasize secrecy, the protection of humanity, kind of like this. We use the dangerous tools, but we have the knowledge and responsibility to do it with like a sense, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's like we have the knowledge and wisdom to use these things or keep them from the general public where they could be corrupting or dangerous.
And because you're a SAVE agent, or an envoy, I should say, you get resources and training provided by the organization. You have access to intel and special things, but you're also kind of being hunted by people who are opposing SAVE. So you're sort of always having to like watch your back. You know, it's not like, it's kind of like there's a degree of spy versus spy, I guess you might say.
Yeah. The unknown, while it's the SAVE term for whatever that, sometimes in the way that it's written feels a bit like Spectre in James Bond, where it sometimes feels like maybe not a firm organization, but like a sort of linked level of alliances that might connect back to some supernatural entity, probably a vampire.
Often a vampire.
I don't know, I think Machiavellian supernatural horror villain, and I think vampire. I don't see the werewolf doing that.
No, maybe a mummy.
Maybe a mummy.
Maybe. If there's some type of amulet involved.
That's true.
But the game is rich with global mythological references and urban legends. Like, that's where they draw these monsters. So things like fighting the mummy would be right on theme with this game, which is fun. It is the pulpy, campier side of horror, and I think chill works best when you're doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, like that's where the strength of this game comes into. And it kind of is nice because I know this is not a perfect reference, but SAVE is a bit like XCOM, where you have these missions, right? Where you're like, oh, a werewolf has gotten loose in London. We know about that. Let's go to London and fix that, right? Or instead, there is a zombie outbreak in China. So we have to travel there and contain that and destroy the artifact that's created it or something, right?
Yeah.
So there's these like fun, like hopping around the globe to fight these crazy supernatural events, right? So what I'm taking away from this game is that there's a lot of like neat little ideas that lay together, but they haven't been tied together into a cohesive whole or executed in a really unique way that is kind of deserving of what the theme is, which is probably the most interesting thing going on here.
Yeah, I almost think that it's strange to say that the lore is general, because a lot of what they describe the unknown as just feels sort of like horror legends or even urban legends. It's loose enough that you can do whatever you want with. But I actually think that this part of the book is the best part.
Yes.
And the rules are kind of, I could take it or leave it. I don't know that it's funny, when we first picked this up, I'm like, I want to try running this. And I started reading it and I'm like, man, it's so hard to kind of parse how this book is supposed to work. And the rules feel really cumbersome for what at least I'm used to. So I decided to pass on that. But I do think taking save and the world of Chill is probably not a bad thing to base a campaign on. You could even probably take Chill and Cthulhu mechanics and play Chill using that, and it might be a bit more streamlined, especially if you're using 7th edition, which is buttery smooth as far as D100 goes.
That's right. I think it's a fun idea. Neat ideas are included in here, but I might go elsewhere for my horror fix.
Mechanically, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, but that would be our takeaways on Chill. Next week, we are going to dive into something that's very related to this, keeping up with our October theme. So we're going to do shock and horror mechanics as they appear in tabletop games, predominantly in role-playing and war games. And we'll give a good breakdown of that. I think there are a lot of games that have interesting ways of looking at psychology in them. And it's kind of fun to see the different interpretations of that.
Yeah. So until then, happy gaming and have fun.
Have a great one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.